All right, what's up, guys? I'm going to talk about gear and stat priority in PvP for Blade Storms. I've been getting a lot of questions, or I've seen a lot of questions in the past about people asking, what's the best stat for Blade Storms in PvP? Is it mastery? Is it haste? Is it perception? And we'll sort of go through all of that, as well as my recommendations for the path of gear that you want to go. Whether or not you are a like a veteran player who's been playing since week one and who's been building up the currencies, or if you're a new player, this is what I would recommend. So first things first, we'll talk about is stat priority. So in the previous video, we talked about how important Illusory Blade is for melee spell swords. You have to keep in mind which are the important skills and what are your hardest hitting skills. Now, if we talk about hardest hitting skills, it's got to be Illusory Blade and it's got to be Snow Silence, right? These two skills are your go-tos for that. So what we want to do is we want to focus on stats that boost our damage for Silent Snow and also Illusory Blade. So let's go into the stats page now. So first thing we'll look at, there's a lot of stats here, but there's only a few that are very important that you really need to focus on. And they're mainly here, right here under the normal stats page. So the first thing that we'll look about is mastery. So mastery is a stat that boosts damage, but depending on which class and what spec you play, it boosts the damage of different skills. Now for Bladestorm, you can see here that it boosts the damage of Illusory Blade, Divine Retribution skills, Star Shower, and Cold Sky. Now, the important thing to focus here is Illusory Blade and Divine Retribution, right? We talked about Cold Sky before, which is the dot, which does count as free damage, but it doesn't make up a significant portion of your damage. It's nowhere near as close to Illusory Blade or Divine Retribution skills. So that's why when we look at mastery, we have to focus on the first part. And Star Shower is also, you really don't need to worry about Star Shower. It's very rare that you're getting a significant amount of damage from Star Shower, and so we'll just stay away from that. So this is the reason why mastery, in my opinion, is the most important stat for Blade Storms. Now, of course, physical attack, physical strength, right? All of these other physical stats, they do help as well. And you would think that it might be more important than mastery because it boosts the damage of all your skills, right? But the most important thing to keep in mind is what proportion or what skills are doing the majority of your damage, right? And it has to be Illusory Blade. So point for point, you're going to get more damage out of building mastery than any other stat. And that's the reason why mastery is the most important. Now, one thing that I will say about melee spellsword is that I believe that you can honestly make use of a lot of different stats, and that is one advantage of melee spellsword. But the disadvantage of this is that when you look at mastery for a lot of other classes, you'll see, for example, if we're talking about Zerkers, mastery for Zerkers boosts the damage of their Cloud Ripper and their Phantom damage and their Voracious Wolf, and those three are honestly probably make up 90% of the damage, if not more, for a Zerker. Whereas if we look at Illusory Blade, maybe that's like 60% of the damage, and Divine Retribution is maybe another, 10%, 15% sometimes, right? So mastery can benefit different classes, unfortunately, in different ways. But I don't want to complain about two classes too much, but it's just that you should note that yes, we can double dip in terms of which skills we benefit a lot from, but it's not that huge of a buff in terms of damage compared to some other classes, which is why I want to move on to some of the other stats here. So after mastery, I think the next most important stat, honestly, and I've also asked Genexi this and other Diamond Plus, 2800 plus Blade Storms from the Chinese servers, and they think that basically after mastery, all the other physical stats are equally important, honestly. And so that's why, whether it be physical attack, physical strength, another stat is agility, right? Agility can increase both, physical strength and also the chance of crits. So all of these, it doesn't matter, because honestly, on a lot of these pieces, you don't get to choose the perfect ideal lines for the stat bonuses. If I had to choose 3, I think my 3 would probably be mastery, agility, and physical strength. Now you notice that I don't mention perception, right? And I have to explain what perception is. So in a lot of different MMOs, you have a chance of missing, and there's an accuracy stat. And when you miss, you do 0 damage, and you just completely whiff the skill. It's as if you never use the skill at all, but it eats the cooldown. So in this game, Solo tries to stay away from that, and instead, you can think of perception as an accuracy stat, but instead of doing 0% damage when you miss, you do 30% damage. So you look at the tooltip here, it says you do reduced damage by 70%. So you only do 30% of the damage. Now, the reason why I don't recommend this above a certain amount is because once you reach 100% perception, right, you already have 100% accuracy. But another thing that's important to keep note of, though, is that when you enter PvP, for example, let's say you enter a duel arena. I mean, not the duel arena, but let's say you enter the 3v3 arena. Let's say you enter a duel, or you enter the battleground 10v10, 15v15. You'll notice that the stats look different than when you're out here in the open world. And that's because Solo has a hidden PvP stat balancing adjustment. And so you'll notice here, this is a PvP dummy, and I'm here in Cloud Rise in the duel area. You'll notice that if I start hitting the dummy, my stats will begin to change. So if you look here, my perception right now is 91.9. Look at my haste, it's 3.03. Now, you will lose some stats here, but you also gain some stats. So you can see here that I went from 91.9 to over 100% perception, right? And you'll see that my haste went from 3% all the way up to 11% as soon as I went into combat with this dummy. So you can see that with perception, right, you don't need more than 91.8%, because even at 91.8%, that bonus 8.2% that you're getting will already put you at 100% perception, right? That's why if you want to look at perception as a stat, I would stop at 91.8. I wouldn't go above that. If you're really close to that, I would consider getting it. Another thing that you can also do to add and get a minor amount of stats for is these buffs right here. I call these the weekly buffs because when you get it, they last for 7 days. You can get the red one from the Blood Ruvia merchant. It's usually offensive stats, so you can usually get 1% physical strength / magic power. You can get 1% perception. You can get 1% haste, things like that. These buffs do work in PvP, in arena. And so that's why even if you're a PvP only player, you do need to do some PvE, because these buffs are very nice. And although they don't make a significant difference, it's something that it's nice to have to supplement your gear, so that, for example, like we said, perception, you can reach 100% when you're in PvP mode easier. And so, like I said, you need to get this from Blood Ruvia, and you need level 5, I believe it's prestige, with the merchant in order to get that. And you can get level 5 pretty easily just by doing dailies, weeklies, or just killing Blood Ruvia mobs. The blue one is usually a defensive weekly buff, and this buff is obtained from the Turquoise Lantern faction merchant over in Cloud Rise. I'll show you that later in the video where you get the buffs, but you can usually choose from 1% HP, 1% physical defense, 1% magic defense, 1% critical resistance, things like that. So I think that with these, you really can't go wrong. It depends on what you're trying to do, right? Because if we want to choose for the offensive stats, if we want to choose between physical strength, that's a nice general one. 1% perception, I would choose that if you don't have 91.8% perception already, or if you're really close and you don't want to get a different gear piece, or you can't find that extra gear piece, I would take perception. Crit is also not bad. It depends how often you prefer to run the rune that removes your ability to crit. So if you really like that glyph, then maybe you don't take crit, or if you don't usually you see yourself running that, crit is also not a bad option. For the defensive buffs, I would recommend, honestly, this one's just in general, it depends what you struggle with. If you find yourself struggling more with magic classes like bards, summoners, spell swords. If you're seeing a lot of those, you can go ahead and take the magic defense one. If you're encountering, you feel like you're having a lot of trouble with Zerkers, melee spell swords, reapers, spears, things like that, go ahead and take the physical defense one. The 1% crit one, I'm not a huge fan of, just because I feel like crits, they're nice. It sucks when it happens, but I'd rather have a buff that benefits me all the time, right? Not just when the enemy crits. 1% HP, this is sort of a good mix, right? If you're not 100% sure, if you just want to balance between, magic defense, physical defense, right? Having 1% overall increased health just helps you that extra little bit. So those, I just wanted to cover that really quickly when we talk about perception, because if you are short on that perception, those buffs can go ahead and they can help you out with those necessary stats. Now, if we want to go further with this, like I said, you'll see that if you look at the physical strength and my mastery, you'll see that when I start using some skills, I'll actually lose some of these stats. Some of these stat losses are because of your astral map. You'll notice that these astral points don't apply in PvP. And that's why also you'll see that I lose HP when I enter combat, when I go into PvP mode. Right now I have 10.6k, but you'll see here when this buff runs out, you'll see when I'm not in PvP mode, I'll actually have, I believe, around 10.9 or something, something closer to 10.9. Yeah, you'll see here, or 11k actually. So I actually lose a good amount of HP when I go into PvP mode because I have those astrals. But you also see that you do gain some stats when you're in PvP. So one thing last thing I want to talk about for stat wise, I want to talk about haste. Haste, the reason why I don't like building this stat in PvP is because, a lot of people talk about, or they theory craft and they think, okay, if I build a lot of haste, that'll benefit me in PvP because my cooldowns will be shorter, right? And this way I'll be able to get more illusory blades out. I'll be able to use my trinket more. I'll be able to use, a lot of different other skills more often, right? And they think that has its benefits. Now, the important thing to notice in Swords of Legends is that haste works in reducing some of your cooldowns, but it's not all cooldowns, right? And that's something that if you're just reading the tooltip, you might not see. If you go ahead and you hover over your skills, right? So if we look at skills with cooldowns, specifically attack in all directions, you'll see that attack in all directions has a base cooldown of 20 seconds on the tooltip. Now you'll note that this 20 seconds is in white font, white text. That means that this skill is not affected by haste. Doesn't matter if you have 3% haste, doesn't matter if you have 20% haste or 100% haste, the cooldown of that skill will not change. It will always be 20 seconds. And the same is true for Illusory Blade. That's why if you think that you want to build haste for Illusory Blade, that's a bad idea, because Illusory Blade will always be 22 seconds, no matter how much haste you have. Now, let's look at some of the skills that do benefit from haste. So if we go down the line here, Blade Pentagram is a nice skill that is shortened cooldown because of haste. But however, Blade Pentagram is a nice ability to help you with resource management, and I did talk about how much I like Blade Pentagram, but again, it's not one of your key skills for dealing damage, right? And that's why I focus more on damage, and so I don't like building haste just for utility purposes. Now, if we look at Chaos and World's Beginning, this skill also not affected by haste. We'll go down the line. Cleansing Wind, not affected. Left click, right click's also not affected, right? There's no cooldown. Cloud Stop Your Interrupt, not affected by cooldown. Boundless Will, not affected. Heavenly Sword, not affected. Okay, but your heal circle is affected. But however, the heal is very, very minor. And the cooldown is already that long. Getting a little bit more haste, right? If you look at it, it's 53.4 now. When I enter PvP, even if I had 11%, it's still around 50 seconds, right? And so you can see it's not worth building haste just to decrease that cooldown, right? Illusory Blade we covered, does not affected by haste. Cloud Shadow, not affected by haste. Flickering Blade is benefited by haste, but the cooldown's already so short. You can see even with 11% haste, it's at 14.4 seconds. With 3%, it's not that much longer, right? You'll see here, once I leave combat, it's 15 seconds, right? And so it's like the difference of 1 second, even when you increased your haste amount by 8%. And so that's why you need a significant amount of haste investment to get a good amount of cooldown reduction. And it's just not worth it. Silent Snow, this is another good cooldown, which is affected by haste. However, the cooldown is so long already, I wouldn't bother again getting a few seconds reduction. Just because if you look at the frequency at which you're using skills, you don't use Silent Snow more than maybe 3 or 4 times in an entire match, right? You're not going to get much use out of it. Even if you decrease the cooldown, you're not going to get a 5th or 6th Silent Snow, right? That's insane. You just wouldn't be able to reach it. And so that's why when you look at a lot of these skills, it's mostly utility skills that are affected the most by haste. And that's why haste is more of a utility rather than, I would say, a pure offensive damage stat for melee blade storms. Now, let's talk a little bit, go back to some of the stats like crit, right? I know a lot of lines common on gear when you're looking at gear. Sometimes your gear has critical hit physical damage, right? Now, this critical hit physical damage, it's a little misleading. It doesn't actually affect how much damage your crits do in PvP. When you enter PvP, it may look like, again, it may look like it's 60% here on the tooltip, but once you enter PvP, you take a look at it, and you'll see that crits only do 36% bonus damage in PvP. It does not matter how much critical hit physical damage you have, it remains the same over at 36%. Now, you'll see that if I remove, I have this glyph here from our previous video, but you'll see here that this glyph, even when I remove it, right, you'll see here, gosh, I'm trying to get out of combat here. You'll see the critical hit rate changes though. So right now I have 11%, right? If I take off this piece of gear, you'll see I lose critical hit rate. So it's very important to know that the gear itself, when it says critical hit physical damage, it actually only means critical hit rate. And that's why I don't bother really building too much of this. And it's mostly, again, I would say it's mostly for critical hit rate. So in a previous video, I did talk about critical hits, and I want to reiterate that for this video. So again, we looked at the 2 major skills, the biggest, hardest hitting skills from Bladestorm, and that's Illusory Blade and Silent Snow. Now you'll notice when I use Illusory Blade there, you'll notice that it doesn't do one big burst of damage, right? You'll notice if I, especially here, if I go to the combat log, you'll notice when I use Illusory Blade, the damage of Illusory Blade actually comes out in 5 different hits, right? So the reason why I don't like crit so much is because let's say you do score a crit, you need to score a crit on all 5 hits of Illusory Blade in order to see a massive, dramatic increase of 36% damage. If you crit only on 1 hit, you know, you do an extra maybe here 200 damage, right? But you don't see a huge benefit from crit. And that's why I personally don't like to build intentionally a lot of critical hit rate. Again, sometimes you don't have a choice, right? You get what you get sometimes, and sometimes you do end up with a piece with haste. Sometimes you do get a piece with critical hit physical damage. I myself personally, I would just focus on the main stat line first, which would be mastery, and then picking up as many useful secondary or tertiary lines as possible. So you can see here, even though I have critical physical damage and I don't like it as much as some of the other stats, I'll go ahead and I'll use this anyway. So the same thing, I want to go back to Snow Silence, right? If you look at the combat log here, when I use Snow Silence, the same thing happens. This damage of Snow Silence is split into 5 different hits. So in order to see a huge increase in damage due to crits, you would need to crit on all 5 hits of Snow Silence. And so that's the reason why I don't intentionally build for critical hit damage. Now, an important point to bring up here is also perception, right? Perception kind of works like accuracy in the same sense. And so if you have 97% perception, I wouldn't worry about it too much. I think it's nice to have 100% just because I know my damage is going to be consistent when I have 100%. But let's say you're at 99%, 98%, 97%. It's not a huge deal just because, again, let's say you miss, right, on 1 hit. It's okay because, yeah, you'll still only do 30% of damage on that hit, but you still have a bunch of different chances of doing normal damage on your other hits of Illusory Blade or Snow Silence, right? So it's sort of like crit doesn't benefit you a whole lot when you play Blade Storm, but it's also the same thing as if you don't have that much perception, it's not that big of a deal. It's not that big of a negative side effect for Blade Storms. And so I just wanted to cover that and go over my explanation and the math on why it's not a huge deal one way or another, right? Now, if you think about it, this is a positive side effect, right? It's also somewhat a bit of a negative, right? If you score that critical hit, it's not that beneficial. Whereas if you say, let's say, if you play a Zerker, right? Let's say you get a huge Cloud Ripper off, right? Or let's say you get a huge Voracious Wolf attack off, right? Or maybe you're a Bard, right? That huge Note Melody. Those single hit damage, huge damage bursts, you're rolling the dice with those, right? If you get a one crit, it could massively boost your damage. Or if you get one miss on those skills, it could be, a huge loss. It could be a huge deficit in a round, right? Those are, it could easily swing the round one way or another. So that's why you can think of it as a benefit. You can also think of it as a downside, right? Then let's go over some of the other stats. Critical resistance. I know some people look at this and they think it's really good, but again, just because of the fact that crits don't happen that often, and even when they do, it's only 36% damage, I don't worry too much about my critical resistance. But that's up to you. I know some players really do like critical resistance, especially those blue gems and those weapon artifacts, and so they like that. But I don't worry too much about it. And of course, since we're melee Blade Storm, you don't want to build, certainly not any of the magic power stuff. You got to be careful, right? Especially when you're looking at gear pieces in the shop. You want to make sure that you're choosing those physical stat gear pieces. You don't want to accidentally waste your writs or waste your maple stamps and buy a piece that is magic stats. So be very, very careful with that. And I think that pretty much covers it for stats. The next thing that of course, stamina, 100 strikes, those are all both very nice. When we look at gear pieces, specifically PvP pieces, if you compare it with a PvE piece, for example, you'll notice that PvE pieces don't have these lines of tenacity and 100 strikes. So tenacity is sort of like PvP damage reduction, and 100 strikes is sort of like a damage multiplier in PvP. In general, more 100 strikes, always good. More tenacity, always good. But you don't get that much extra 100 strikes when it comes to gear pieces when you compare them. One benefit, though, is you do try to want to get full red gear over purple gear, because one, red gear will have 3 lines of stats, and so you'll have an extra line of bonus free stats. But the other benefit, too, from red gear is that you can get +3. You see here on this piece, I have 3 upgrade slots. On this piece here, I have 5 upgrade slots. Every time you upgrade, you get a tiny bit. It's usually, 0.1, 0.2, 0.3 extra stats for each line that you have. And it'll also increase stats like 100 strikes, stamina, and tenacity. And so if you, in general, try to get the important lines like mastery, try to get a gear that has as many upgrade slots as possible, right? 5 is a good amount, and so that's what you want to try to aim for. So for example, if you have 255 pieces, if you have 260 pieces, look at which one has more mastery, look at which one has more upgrade slots, and look at which one has better tertiary and secondary lines. So now we'll also go over gearing for PvP. So if you're an older player, and you've been playing since week 1 for PvP, you've been building up those writs, you've been building up those maple stamps, you can go ahead and just buy whatever gear is an upgrade for you, right? You don't have to, you probably already bought 60 gear and now you're moving on towards 70 gear, and so you don't, obviously you just buy whatever you can get. Whatever's an upgrade, look at those and you just buy those. Now if you're a new player, right, I've been playing a fresh Bard and a fresh Zerker as my ults, and I've been collecting writs, and you'll notice that you'll actually have a buff here in the top left when you are, actually one thing I do want to mention real quick, this is where you get the Turquoise Lantern weekly buff, and this is where you get the Blood Rivia weekly buff right here. So if you've been a new player, you'll see up here in the top left, you'll actually have a buff that increases the rate at which you get writs. And so it's very important to do BGs, 10v10, 15v15, get your writs of the continents. And even if you're not a new player, it's very important to do these. You'll see here on the weeklies and the dailies, you'll see you'll have the Chang'an Battle Arena, you'll have the Blade Echo, and you'll have the Battle of the Continents every day. As well as there's some rotating dailies. Like sometimes there's this Demon Destruction and Gilding. You always want to try to do your dailies because they're always free writs, they're free combat spirit, and they're free seal stones as well. So you always want to try to do those. If you can't do the other ones, I sometimes I slack off a lot when it comes to the PvE dailies, but I do always try to make sure I do my dailies for my PvP dailies. And the same goes for weeklies, right? You want to do these and you want to get up that combat spirit. So what combat spirit is, I failed to explain this earlier, but combat spirit is sort of like general PvP experience. You have your own, there's a combat spirit rank here, and the combat spirit rank determines what kind of gear you can get from the battlegrounds vendor here, the Ritz vendor. So if you see here, if you click on the gear shop, you'll see that there's prerequisites. So even if you have the right number of Ritz, you can't buy the gear here in the continent vendor because of the fact that there's a prerequisite on the combat spirit. So this one's like Crimson Moonlight. I don't know exactly which one this is, but again, it requires a lot of combat spirit. And so when you're going for combat spirit, you start off with Battle Cry 1 2 3 4, then you go Dragon Thunder 1 2 3 4, right? And you keep on going on and on. And the way that you get combat spirit is, again, the main way is by doing your dailies, right? Your dailies will give you a ton of combat spirit. You look at just one of these, right? Let's look at the Chang'an Battle Arena. Okay, I guess this one doesn't give you combat spirit. But for example, if you look at the faction daily, right, that gives you 400 combat spirit just on its own. And that one you can whip out in 10-15 minutes, right? So you absolutely want to do these. Make sure, try not to skip these. If you can only log in and do a few things, right, in your PvP player, absolutely do your PvP dailies and weeklies. And then the next thing that I wanted to talk about with combat spirit is, you'll see here, you actually have every week you have a combat spirit weekly track. And so this caps out, the last reward is at 8,000, but you can get more than 8,000 combat spirit. But you'll see here along the way, you'll get little boxes that give you writs, they give you money, they give you PvP seal stones, right? I think some of them maybe even give you some gems or some jades. But the main thing you want to do, especially as a newer player, is try to get this 8k combat spirit reward. And the reason why you want to get this is because it gives you a free piece of gear. So when you are Battle Cry 4 and below, I believe it's anything below Dragon Thunder 3 actually, when you get this 8k battle spirit combat spirit reward track, when you hit that 8k, you'll get a piece of 55 gear. And this gear, it can be, again, if you read the tooltip, it can be a weapon, it could be a relic, it could be an armor. So this is very nice to have just to give you some free gear pieces. Even if it doesn't have ideal stat lines, right? Extra gear is always nice. Now you can see here, this one gives me a 60 box, but that's because I've already passed Dragon Thunder 3 and Dragon Thunder 4. And so eventually you'll get 65 gear, you'll get 70 gear. And so that's why you always want to try to get at least 8k combat spirit. And it's not that difficult to get. As long as you're doing your dailies, your weeklies, do a couple of battlegrounds, right? Because you'll see here, there's a victory reward for winning a battleground. And especially important is you want to cap out your daily wins. You can see here, I didn't do a really good job today. I didn't get all my daily wins, but every day there's a daily win amount, and it'll give you extra combat spirit, extra writs, and an extra box too for your bronze chest, just to get some extra seal stones. So this is very useful. Always want to try to max out your BG rewards if possible. And also PvP arena. Also, if you look at here, if you win, you get 20 combat spirit. So it's not as much, but you know, sometimes the games are faster. So it just depends what you like. But again, I always do recommend doing some battlegrounds, just because of the fact that battlegrounds is the only way to get writs. And with combat spirit, if you do the 3v3 arena, right, you don't get writs at all. And writs is very important because it's the main PvP currency. And you look here, right? If you look at the writs shop, everything is in writs. You need a lot of writs. So you always want to do your dailies and weeklies. Another form of PvP currency, though, is the maple stamps. And these maple stamps, this is the 3v3 currency, right? You'll see here that I got 4,500 maple stamps. You can only receive maple stamps in 3v3. And you'll notice here that there's a weekly limit of 3,000, where if I look at the writs max, the base writ max for weekly is 12,000. So it's way higher than maple stamps. And so that's why everybody should be doing battlegrounds. Do your 10v10s, do your 15v15s. But you also want to cap out on your red maple seals, because it allows you to use this vendor here. And you look at this vendor, and this vendor sells gear. First of all, he has two options. You can buy gear. First of all, you're always going to use maple stamps. But here, the first option allows you to buy gear with maple stamps and writs. Whereas here, you can see that you're just buying gear with purely with maple stamps. And you can see here that the cost of maple stamps for this gear is way higher than the cost of maple stamps when you're looking at other gear, right? And so that's why you always want to make sure that you are using this first option. You want to supplement the cost with writs, because it's way easier to get writs. And so never buy from the second shop, always buy from the first shop. Use a combination of your currencies. That's why PvP rewards you for playing both 3v3s and 10v10/15v15. So that's something to keep in mind. Another thing that I want to talk about with your dailies and weeklies is that you'll see here that some days you'll have an event called Demon Destruction and Gilding. Now this event spawns a big boss at the faction area, and you want to try to tag this boss. You want to try to do as much damage as you can to this boss, because when the boss dies, whichever faction has dealt the most damage will complete the daily for that day, and you'll get a chance at free 60 gear drops, but you also get this free writs here. Another special event is the Dragon Song Battle. Now this happens on Tuesdays, and I believe it happens on Fridays. I think it's Tuesdays and Fridays it happens, and it happens at 8 p.m. Eastern to 9 p.m. Eastern, so it lasts for 1 hour. But if you do the whole event, it gives you a ton of writs, it gives you a ton of combat spirit very, very, very fast. So I highly recommend this if you can make it. If you can't make it, it's not the end of the world, but it is very, very nice. So then, so now I'll talk about what you should be buying as a newer player, since I've already kind of gone ahead and mentioned what you should be doing as a veteran player. If you're a newer player, I would first, again, do 3v3s, do your 10v10, 15v15, but make sure that you're doing as much and try to cap out on as many red maple seals as possible, because when you buy from the 3v3 vendor, all this gear here is 70 gear. All of it has 5 upgrade slots, and so it's pretty much right now best in slot. And so if you can buy from this shop, I would go ahead and I would skip out on a 60 piece, because there's no point in buying a 60 piece that you're going to go ahead and replace with the best in slot here. Now if you look at this gear, there's you don't see it here, but there's 2 prerequisites for this gear. On the other Brits gear vendor, the prerequisite is having a certain amount of combat spirit, but for this vendor there is there's a time limit, right? So this gear, you can't buy it until this time. So this gatekeeps you, and so that you can't just spam BGs. I mean, you can't just spam 3v3s all day and just buy the best gear in the game. You do have to wait for some of these to unlock. Now, most of the gear has already been unlocked, and you can buy a lot of the 70 pieces right now, assuming you have the red maple seals. And so that's why I think it's very, very important to go ahead and try to buy this, because you can get this 70 gear much faster than you can go ahead and buy 70 gear from the BG vendor. And so that's why I highly recommend, do your 3v3s. Make sure you're buying this gear first. And then if you can't get the 70 gear piece, or you feel like you can't get it soon, then go ahead and use your writs, buy the 60 pieces from this vendor. And then eventually you'll be able to buy 70 pieces from both vendors sooner or later. Another thing is that's specifically for buying gear for your weapons, your armors, and your relics, right? But for accessories, right now we only have access to this shop for accessories, which is 60 gear. And again, you want to make sure you buy the appropriate gear piece that has physical strength, right? Because that's what blade storms are. Another way that you can get an extra accessory here is a 70 accessory. You'll notice from the battle pass, you don't even have to pay for this. This comes with the free battle pass. On the 11th day, if you do this every day, you can get 10 tokens. On the 11th day, when you get 110 tokens, you can get a free 70 earring, and you can get the second free 70 earring on the 30th day if you're doing it every week. So I highly recommend doing this too, even if you're just a PvP player. So now we'll talk about another, I guess, way of gearing, which is the last way, which is battle squads. So I highly recommend trying to find people to play with, because battle squads are its own type of ranking, and you specifically have to create a battle squad. If you go here, since I'm already in a battle squad, you want to try to get your battle squad rating as high as possible, because every week there's a reward for playing, either getting 10 victories with your battle squad or playing 20 total games. And it's a free chest here, and it's opposed to, so if you look here, if your battle squad is 1,000 to 14.99, you get a free 55 piece. 1,500 to 19.99, you get 60 piece, so on and so forth. And you'll see, unfortunately, right now, it's the 70 gear box is for 2,500. It's not unlocked yet. We should be getting the 2,500, but again, since it's not unlocked, we're just getting the 65 gear piece. So this is also something that's nice to have. But again, it's not right now. It's not as good as the 70 gear pieces that you can already get from the 3v3 vendor. But eventually, when you do get 70 gear, this will end up becoming the best gear in the game. But don't worry about this too much if you're a newer player. Just make sure you're doing your 3v3s and your 15v15s. So that about wraps it up for PvP. Oh, actually, one more thing, which is the jades in your gear. So if you look at your accessories, right, your necklaces, your rings, and your relics, you'll have slots for jades, which just gives you free bonus stats too. I use, again, I think mastery is the most important stat. I use mastery in my rings and my necklace. For the relics, I prefer attack. Again, I'm more of an offensive player. I like to play more offensively, but there's also, if you use blue gems, you can get critical resistance. I just like to use red and green, but again, it's personal preference, whatever you like. I just wanted to cover those real quick. You don't have to worry about them too much, honestly. It's not that huge of a difference in stats, but it is just something to keep a note of to get. But that just about wraps this video up. This was a pretty long video too, but I think that there were some important things to talk about, and I do want to try to go more in depth with these kind of videos. And so I hope that, you know, if you've been watching for this long, I hope this video really does help you out. If you have any questions, go ahead and leave them in the comments. I'll be adding more videos to this series, and I hope you guys have a good one. All right, bye-bye.